Hi everyone, it's Amanda McKenzie here. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Climate Council's webinar, Glasgoing, Going, Gone, What Now? So tonight we're discussing the key outcomes of COP26 that has just occurred in Glasgow and what we need to do now to secure strong action on climate change this decade in Australia, but also around the world. So I wanted to begin with an acknowledgement of country and acknowledging the traditional owners of the custodians of the land of wherever you are meeting us from today. So for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I live in Melbourne, and I'd like to respect their elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to elders from wherever you are and anyone joining us today. I was reminded while watching the COP and seeing so many powerful Indigenous voices, both from Australia and First Nations voices from right around the world, of my first experience at a COP, which was in Bali in 2007, and hearing a panel from activists from the Torres Strait to a range of different places around the Pacific. And it was when the penny dropped for me as really, or not really the penny drop, but like that human impact, the feeling of climate change and how bad it could be. When I was hearing from them and hearing a woman from the Torres Strait talk about how they were already having to visit graveyards of their ancestors in boats because sea level inundation had already affected their islands to such a degree. And that was that sort of oof moment. This is something that I need to be working on for life. I think those voices of First Nations in capturing why the issue is so important has been critical at these international negotiations and in so many other contexts. So I wanted to thank you as well for questions that have been coming through. We've had things coming through all week. There's lots of great questions, but also encourage you to submit your questions in the chat as we go through. Our team will be monitoring them and sending them through to me. And as we go through tonight, I'll be popping them up. I'd also encourage you to include in the chat now, include the country that you're joining us from today in the comment section. So I'll also introduce you to our panelists, and I'm sure you know them well. So Professor Tim Flannery, you can wave, Tim. He's our Chief Councillor, and I'm sure he's very, very familiar to you as an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, conservationist, communicator, and 2007 Australian of the Year. We have Greg Bourne, who hopefully is quite familiar to you too. He does a lot of media work for the Climate Council, but he's been working at this nexus of climate change, energy, business policy for about 30 years, from as diverse portfolios as a CEO of WWF Australia to the chair of ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And we have Nicki Hutley, who came on for the Climate Council a couple of years ago now and has been doing an amazing job talking about the economic impacts of climate change and also the economic opportunities. So she's got experience and expertise in macro and microeconomic forecasting and analysis and has 3 decades of practice in financial and investment markets and economic consulting. The councillor who's not with us tonight, who has been advertised, is Dr Madeline Taylor. She's not on the panel with us because she's got a really sore throat and a cold, but she will be behind the scenes answering questions on the chat. So if you have things specifically for her, she is a senior lecturer at Macquarie Uni in the School of Law, specialising in a whole range of complex issues around energy law, policy, and her current research focus is looking at energy conflicts, landholder rights, and protection of sensitive land uses. So any questions that pique Madeline's interest, she'll be jumping on the chat and answering despite not having a voice tonight. So I'll jump into it as quickly as possible because I'm conscious that we want to hear as much from you as possible. So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions from me, and then we'll go into questions that have been coming through during the week and also as you're putting them in the chat. So to start with, thinking about the COP26 outcomes, I wanted to ask each panelist about what have been some of those key outcomes. So Tim, I'll start with you because you're obviously in Glasgow. I can't believe you managed to get there and back, and with all it wasn't so long ago that we were wondering if you'd even be able to do it with all the COVID restrictions. But can you give us a bit of a flavour of what it was like on the ground and a summary of what happened and what it means for the world?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. Look, forgive me if I'm a bit jet lagged. I got in late last night, so I'm still half of me still in Glasgow, I think. But look, it was an extraordinary COP. I've been to 6 previous COPs, and they've evolved and changed over time. So these meetings have now become these enormous gatherings where you have many heads of states with their negotiating teams. You have business leaders, you have scientists, you have observers, as they're called, people like me. You've got media, you've got protesters, civil society represented in spades. And so you might have, 40,000 people at these meetings, and they work in extremely interesting ways because there is a lot of vertical integration. People complain about the lack of access for the ordinary person into the COP. But in fact, COVID this year made it more difficult, I admit. But, there is quite a lot of vertical integration, a lot of awareness of what's going on. And probably the best guide, because there's hundreds of meetings happening simultaneously, you can't hold it all in your head what's happening. But the best guide for what's happening is really the mood in the conference. And the mood is very evident at each COP. I remember Copenhagen started off optimistic, ended up by halfway through, we knew it wasn't going to go anywhere, Paris had its own particular mood, quite a good starting mood. The mood in this COP was different from any other because it was really determined. In previous COPs, countries like Australia have had plenty of bushes to hide in. There's been a lot of other countries that haven't, or many other countries that haven't wanted action. And there's been a bit of a forgiveness, really, of those countries. Not forgiveness, but tolerance, perhaps we could say. A bit like a kind of mad uncle at a Christmas dinner, you sort of tolerate them, but this COP was different. The mood was that what Australia was doing was, quite frankly, intolerable. The world was moving forward on this, regardless of what Australia was doing. And that mood was expressed by everyone. It wasn't just the leaders and the negotiators. It was the whole thing. There was nowhere for Australia to hide, really. Now, the outcome of the meeting wasn't everything that everyone wanted, particularly the British presidency. They were hoping to get pledges that would take us all the way to 1.5 degrees. As it turned out, we got sufficient pledges to get us to, by some estimates, 1.8, maybe 1.9 degrees, which is still a significant move forward. This is the first time we've ever had a world that's pledged to stay below 2 degrees. So that was a big outcome in itself. There was lots of kind of corollary agreements made, one on coal, I'm sure you all heard about, one on methane, and one on forest protection that involved a subset of countries. Nevertheless, very, very significant steps forward. The big 3 bits of news from the COP that I'd pick out that really are noteworthy. First, that India pledged for the first time ever to net carbon, a net carbon date, 2070, later than we'd like to think. But my Indian friends that I talked to said, this is hugely significant. Forget the date. The fact that they've actually pledged to a target is really, really important. The second big thing that happened was China-US bilateral agreement. 2 largest polluters on the planet have agreed to work together to really ratchet up what they're doing. We shouldn't underestimate that. The third important thing was the agreement that we need to meet in Egypt next year at COP27 and come with larger pledges, more substantial pledges that'll get us down to 1.5. So those 3 things were important. If I'm not running out of time, Amanda, could I just cover a couple of other things?
Go for it.
Thank you so much. One of the other things that I wanted to cover was just the way young people are looking at these big COPs now. It's interesting, when you're in the COP, you realise that what we're doing here is really redesigning the world's energy system. It's an awesome thing to be doing. We're getting all of the political will together to do that. And, there's trade fairs there to show you how to do it. There's business people. It's just awesome to see. And, the people like Greta Thunberg, the blah, blah, blah comment and others they want to go further. They want to live in a world that's got greater equality economically and socially. They want better forms of democracy. And I think that, they look at the COP as a hugely inspiring event. this is, globally, it's one of those, it's probably the most significant global gathering of leaders that we have today. And young people are saying, well, if you can do it for energy, why can't you do it for the economic system? Why can't we do it for social inclusion and equality? Why can't we do it to reform our politics? And they're great aspirations. And I really think that as we watch COPs develop and grow, we're seeing a new form of global direction setting taking place. It really was inspiring to me, I think, to be there at a meeting like that. I'll leave it there because I know the others will want to add their bit too. But
thanks, Tim. That's really insightful. And I remember actually the first time we spoke on a panel together was at the COP in Copenhagen in 2009.
That's
and
right.
What a way we've come in, relatively short period, a decade. It's poles apart from where we were in Copenhagen, I think.
Oh, look, that's right. And sorry, just one more thing I wanted to add. Probably the single most important meeting that happened 2 months before the COP. And that was the meeting of major investment banks. So 45 investment banks, most of the majors, I think, except Morgan Stanley, had agreed they would only fund new projects which were consistent with a 45% cut in emissions by 2030. So it's $1.33 trillion worth of financing sitting there behind this. And I spoke to Keith Hutley, one of the engineers of this kind of financial COP, if you want to call it that, Australian. He's with Citibank. And I said, do you think we'll get to 1.5 degrees? He said, I have absolutely no doubt we'll get to 1.5 degrees now because the money is going to make the reality. And it's absolutely true, I think. But anyway.
That's just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nicki, can you tell us a little bit, you're obviously watching from Australia, seeing this happen, what you think it means for Australia? And obviously we've seen the Australian government's response, but I'd love you to sort of talk us through what you think will be the pressure on Australia going forward and what it means for us.
Yeah, so I think even before we got to Glasgow, there was pressure building this year in a way that we hadn't seen it. We had, G7 meetings. We've had the International Energy Agency come out and talk about the phase down of coal for the first time. There's this growing global pressure to talk about the transition away from fossil fuels in a much more meaningful way than we had seen before. And unfortunately, the Australian federal government was sitting there still saying, no, nothing to see here, nothing's changed. And I think we need to look very carefully and differently between what's happening at state and even local levels versus what's happening at the federal level. But we put out a report, as you know, just before COP on the carbon border adjustment mechanism that was announced by the EU in the middle of this year. Now, for those on the seminar tonight, that's basically a tax on carbon for countries who either don't have a carbon price or have a much lower carbon price than the country that they're wanting to export goods to. So for Australia, that might be things like steel. In the future, it could include things like coal and LNG. And what that essentially means is that we're going to become a whole lot less competitive. And our modelling suggested that in the sort of states that are heavily dependent on particularly coal, Queensland and New South Wales, tens of thousands, more than 50,000 jobs could be lost if you saw widespread carbon border adjustment in major economies where there is already a carbon price system. One of the things that there's been a lot of criticism of the federal government's modelling, economic modelling of their so-called plan. But one of the things that they did call out was the higher cost of interest rates. And we heard the Treasurer talk about that a couple of months ago, because other countries are saying we're less inclined to lend money to you because you're not doing the right thing. We've already seen that. Research has shown that in climate vulnerable economies, interest rate premiums have already gone up somewhere between about 0.7 and 1 percentage point. So the cost of capital goes up, and that affects every single one of us. It's not just the coal industry and jobs. But probably the thing that is most, the biggest thing that I take from COP is that we are running out of time, that this pressure is building. There is a global commitment, as Tim said, to really change track. And we can either move with it and have a planned transition, or we can be completely left behind. And we will bear these costs. We're already bearing these costs. It's not just about the cost of climate change, which obviously are astronomically high when you think about bushfires and floods and cyclones and the health effects of smoke, you know, just the cost mountain. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. So we're, you know, big costs coming our way if we don't act, but also many dollars worth of opportunity. We've got recent modelists suggesting that we could triple our exports doing green exports, critical minerals, green steel, all those sorts of things, triple the value of our fossil fuels. So there is an economic opportunity. There's an economic adjustment that requires help, but we also can't afford to not go down that path. For me, that momentum is just really has reached fever pitch, I think.
Thanks, Nicki. And it is one of those reflections of every time we come together to talk about climate change over the last however many years, we say it's urgent, we need to do more. And sometimes that urgency message gets lost because it's said so many times. But I think in the current context, as we can see the impacts all around us, it's becoming much easier to illustrate that sort of urgency, as well as what you've just described, Nicki, the urgency of, well, let's not miss out on this economic opportunity that was so clearly put forward in Glasgow. Greg, I wondered if you can elaborate on that a little bit further, particularly what this means for the global energy transition. There was the methane pledge that was put forward, and you know, there was the commentary on the death knell for coal, but there was also a lot of commentary on gas. I wondered if you can talk about the two big fossil fuels and what you think the agreement means for them.
Sure, I will. I'll first, though, just make one reflection, and that was Copenhagen COP, which all three of us were at, actually, where those of us who are sitting in Australia looking at a COP in Glasgow see so much stuff on the geopolitics, that so-and-so didn't turn up and so-and-so did. But when you go to all the COPs, there's all of the geopolitics stuff which goes along. Behind the scenes, as Tim said, there's a huge amount of work which goes on. So coming to the energy side of things, what was interesting was the International Energy Agency had put out their net zero by 2050 plan. And then they had come out with another plan, which is called the World Energy Outlook, and they gave it free to everyone. They normally charge 200 euros a copy, but they gave it free to everyone. So it would actually begin to put a flavor into how to change. And they say very clearly that if we are to beat the challenge of climate change, we have to change totally our energy system throughout the world. Furthermore, they say it can be done. It really can be done. And it was the first time the IEA had given a can-do report and a how-to report, as opposed to we observe. So my first reflection, therefore, is there is a can-do attitude. And at Copenhagen, there was a can't-do attitude. That's a fundamental shift. When I then look at the methane pledge, this is really, really, really important. Methane has been calculated to be around about 30 times as warming as CO2 over a 100-year time frame. We don't have 100 years. So over a 20-year time frame, it's about 85 times more warming than CO2. Things we do now with regard to methane are really, really important. And on a global basis, around about 40% of methane that goes into the atmosphere is just from natural systems. But 60% is us. It's agriculture, it's industry, it's gas, it's us, basically. Now, the pledge to reduce that is absolutely phenomenal, because if we can do that by 2030, if we can halve it by 2030, with its global warming potential 80 times, 86 times what it is of CO2, that is a big effect. Again, that is going to ripple through the oil, coal, and gas industry in an incredibly big way. If you happen to be in that industry and you look at those companies, many of them are now realizing they have to change fast. And there is a very, very good report, if you want to see how things can go. It's called From Ambition to Reality. And that's really important, put out by Worley and Princeton University. And you can see engineers already now, I can do this, but we have to work really, really, really hard. I think that, to me, is the most important thing, this can-do attitude of engineers and engineering folk, that we can do things as we go forward.
Thanks, Greg. I wanted to now touch on the impact of the COP in Australia and more broadly in terms of the political situation. And Tim, I recall you saying, you know, one of the things in Glasgow that was really important was that it's saying we need to come back with stronger pledges in 2022. And of course, Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor have said our 2030 target is fixed and we won't be shifting it. Barnaby Joyce has been out there saying the same thing. And similarly around the coal pledge or statements that have been made in Glasgow and what's included in the pact. Scott Morrison then said, oh, well, of course, Australia's coal is good for decades to come. I wondered, Tim, how Australia was received in Glasgow, in how you saw other countries reacting to Australia, and what do you think the pressure will look like going into 2022 with this expectation of increased targets?
Could I just spend a moment, Amanda, talking about the Australian Pavilion, which gives you a bit of a sense, really, of how it was received. You know, the Australian Pavilion was basically decked out like a coffee shop. It had the best coffee in the whole of the complex. There was lots of people there. There was some seating there for people to talk. But the displays around were either uninformative, so just said the Australian way, or they were dealing with fossil fuels. So we had a big Santos display there on using carbon capture and storage, so they could develop more gas reserves. There was a display on that. There was another display, which was an interesting one actually, on carbon capture with concrete technologies. That was interesting. But there was no Indigenous people represented. They weren't brought over by the federal government. There was a couple of videos shown with Indigenous people, but no actual people. And really nothing about the country's enormous potential with wind and solar. So it was really out of sync totally with everything else. And, you know, like I said, people were offended seeing the fossil fuel interests so blatantly linked to the government. We were the only nation, and I walked right around all the pavilions, that with that blatant link between fossil fuels and the government interest. I think that there was a mood of anger among the more developed countries and observers. Among the Pacific Islanders, there was despair, you know, and can I just tell you one small story, Amanda, that really struck me?
Yeah.
I did an interview with the Papua New Guinea Minister for Forests and Climate Change, very thoughtful man. He explained how PNG is going to protect its forest after 2024, there'll be no round log exports. And, you know, they had a very solid case, and this is what the people of New Guinea want. Anyway, the electors want it. But he just said to me, look, you know, Australia is kind of treating us badly with this. He said, I was chair of a committee that collected $2.3 million from Papua New Guineans to donate to Australians after the bushfires. And I said, wow, that's amazing. He said, yeah, and we had old men walking over mountain ranges with a handful of corn so Australians could start their gardens again. You know, gifts, people spent all day walking over the mountain to support us. And what do we give back? We give back nothing. What we say to them is that, look, if your islands go under the sea, that's less important to us than that we keep our prosperity from selling coal. That's the message we're giving, and it's simply unacceptable. It's an unacceptable message in the modern era. It's morally repugnant. It was seen as that by everyone who was part of this whole thing. And the Pacific and the rest of the world is starting to push back because they now understand how critical and urgent this issue is and how Australia's attitude is a big part of the problem. So I think the world has moved on. The places we used to hide with our mates, Saudi Arabia and Russia, they're no longer there. I mean, even the Saudis, Amanda, were talking about clean energy technologies. UAE was welcoming it. They're very heavily dependent upon fossil fuels, but they can see that the end of the year is at hand. Australia was just so far out of tune with even our, you know, the people we used to ally ourselves with, that it was quite disconcerting as an Australian. I was deeply ashamed at times of you know, what the way that this federal government had decided to portray us as a nation.
And I think then coming back after signing the pact and having clearly signed up to a number of things and then saying the opposite is just, what a terrible embarrassment that has been. Nicki, I wondered if you can reflect further on Scott Morrison and Barnaby Joyce's comments on coal, that there's opportunities for the Australian coal industry for decades ahead, workers should be fine, etc. When you've got this clear statement from the Glasgow Pact that wasn't as strong as it was hoped, because it was changed in the final hours. But I wonder if you could talk about specifically what that means for the coal industry here, and whether this Boris Johnson's comments of the death knell of coal is accurate, or if ScoMo's comments on it's here forever are more accurate.
I think you have to look at different time frames. So nobody's suggesting that coal is going out the door tomorrow or even next year. But the idea that we will still be pushing out a heck of a lot of coal. In fact, I think the economic modelling has double-digit increases, every year between now and 2050. It's so unrealistic. Even if we don't get to the net zero, the International Energy Agency's figures of 55% decline by 2030, they're still talking about, in the sort of most moderate circumstances, they're talking about 5 to 10% decline in global coal demand. So, and that goes ratchets right up to 55%. The idea that we can just dig stuff out of the ground and that demand will be there for it, to me seems wholly naive. I mean, yes, China and India have got longer timelines to net zero than we have, but China has committed to no new foreign investment in coal as of now, no new domestic coal-fired power stations from 2025, and peaking use in 2030. That tells you, that these are our major clients, and others, like Japan and Korea, we will start to see declines from as well, some more quickly than others. It's not true to say that demand is just going to keep going for coal. It's not. It will be, the death knell is there, and it will just take time. So we can either leave our coal communities in the lurch and just say, all right, we're not doing anything to help you transition, or we can do a planned transition. And of course, this is what, particularly the New South Wales government is doing. We've already seen some of that in Victoria, to say, well, what do we need? Where are the areas most affected? What are their natural advantages? What can we invest in? And of course, we're seeing things like renewable energy zones. But the idea that we can just sit here and keep shoveling coal and that the rest of the world will demand it is incredibly naive. I talked a little bit before about carbon border adjustment mechanisms. This is something that is a reality we're going to have to face. We had unabated demand for coal just isn't going to exist. And I suspect, a lot of what the government is hoping is that we will miraculously solve the carbon capture and storage process in the next sort of couple of years, and or that some miraculous unthought of technologies that will also come around. And of course, this isn't the case. And it's actually not fair to the coal communities. The very people that the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister claim to be protecting are the very people that they're actually putting in harm's way by not planning the transition and not accepting the reality of where the rest of the world is going.
Thank you, Nicki. That's very clearly put. Greg, I wondered, there's a few questions coming through around the federal election. I wondered if you can reflect on what the Glasgow COP means for the federal election. We're likely to get a federal election between March and May next year. Both how you think these issues will sort of play over the next few months, but also what people can do to be ensuring that this issue remains at the top of the agenda.
That's a very tricky one, Amanda. Look, the federal election, whether it's March or May, will come and it will go. Probably what we don't want is, a huge fight over just coal, for example. That is probably not the way to go. But Nicki's response with regard to transition, I think, is really, really important. If you look at the coal industry demise in the UK and in Germany and in Poland and so on, where it has been planned, where people have worked on a fair transition, it has worked well. Leaving people in the lurch, burying your own heads in the sand is the worst thing you can do. So maybe pointing out the very fact that we move on, the world moves on, we are going to move on. Helping people in the transition is something that good governments do and bad governments don't. So I have been heard to say a number of times that, you know, at the political level at the moment, you know, we are pushing our products with the zeal of a drug lord, not caring about the misery we create in the future. That is misplaced zeal, absolutely misplaced zeal. So coming to the election, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think any of us do know what's going to happen. But focusing on the future to me is key. Creating jobs for the future. You know, walking into the future, hugging the past is not a winning way. It is actually an un-Australian way. We really have to be creating a new future. We have to be thinking about what's happening in our land. We have to think about what's happening with our traditional owners. We have to be creating new jobs. That is the way I think we can win. Talking about the positive and creating the world that we have to. The world is going to do it. We could be left behind as laggards. That's not where I would want to be.
Mm. Thanks, Greg. The next question I wanted to look at was just to dig a bit deeper into what the targets are. So it can be a bit confusing. There's a lot of numbers that get kind of thrown around what is a credible number by 2030 or 2050. Tim, the Glasgow Pact, as we've mentioned, requires countries to come back and strengthen their 2030 targets. I wondered if you can talk us through what would be a credible number for Australia to be reducing emissions by 2030, and what it means to be in line with the science.
Yeah. Look, I'll tell you briefly about what happened in Scotland, which is incredibly inspirational. So the Scottish Climate Act was passed about 2010, and it set a target of a 42% reduction by 2020, so a decade out. The group I met the man who put the whole program together. His name's Mike Robinson. He's chair of the Royal Geographical Society of Scotland. So he and 49 other lobby groups, including churches, got together to have a common goal. They decided on a common statement, common approach. They represented over half of the electors in Scotland. So they got their way, they were heard. And the 42% came just because one of them had just read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, and 42 is the answer to everything. So the scientists were saying, wow, this is too high and not going to achieve it. The fact is that Scotland got to 42% in 2016. And Mike says the reason it happened was that all those stakeholders felt empowered. This was their thing. They were part of it. They were empowered to do something, and everyone acted. And that mood is still there in Scotland. So in terms of targets, I think Al Gore said it, you know, set a 100% target if you want. It doesn't matter, as long as you've got a target, as long as it's supported by the community and everyone feels empowered and proud to achieve, we would get there. I have no doubt that if we really needed to, we could decarbonise our electricity sector in 5 years. Might not be the most cost-effective way to do it, but we could do it, I'm sure. I mean, largely, maybe there'll be, 5% or 2% still, hanging out there, but we could do it. So I think just set an ambitious target and let people be part of the solution is such an important message. So Australia's this idea of 26 to 28%, I mean, it's going to happen anyway. And what I wonder is, well, what are we paying those people in Canberra for? Are they actually going to do a job, or are they just going to let other people do the job and they take the salary? I mean, they're not planning on doing any legislation, not helping in any way. So, why are we paying them? Anyway, sorry, I'll get off my high horse about that. Probably is jet lag, but so targets are important.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tim. And I'll just mention, if you'd like to learn more about targets, we did a big piece of work at the start of the year called Aim High, Go Fast, which goes into a lot of analysis about where Australia's 2030 target should be, and concludes a 75% reduction by 2030 would be appropriate and in line with the science. Obviously, that's substantially higher than what the government has committed to at the moment. But the BCA, Business Council of Australia, recently came out saying 50% by 2030 was required, which is worlds away from where they were a few years ago. So I think it's interesting how much this space has been changing. Greg, I wondered, sort of following on from that comment about the BCA and from some of what Tim said about stakeholders being engaged and changing, I wondered if you can talk us through the influence of Australian state governments and business ahead of, well, not just Australian, but subnational governments and business ahead of a COP? And then also what influence the pact will have on Australian governments. Oscar has asked us specifically how state and territory governments are likely to respond to what's happened at COP. And I know you've done a lot of work with different state and territory governments, if you could reflect on that too.
Sure. So first, let me come back to targets, because obviously, ScoMo uttered, 26 to 8%. That's where we're staying. We're going to not move from that at all. And he says, and then we're going to beat it. We're going to do 35%. Well, that 35% actually comes from the sum of the targets of the states and the territories that have put forward targets. However, Northern Territory and Western Australia, who have some investments that they want to make in more gas, would actually sort of cripple that if they're not careful. But anyway, so ScoMo is basically taking all the credit for what work is being done by the states and territories. So the way I look at this is there are two things that are going on. One is the states and the territories really know that the people within their territory, within their state, are their people. They're not Canberra's people, they're their people. The various state premiers have been looking after them, during these COVID times. I think it's come home to them very, very strongly. They also win jobs or lose jobs, depending on whether or not they embrace what is going on. So leadership is coming from the premiers and the chief ministers, and which is great. Same with business. Again, come back to the COP. The COP in Copenhagen was the tent there was fully populated by coal people. You could only find coal, oil, and gas people there, pretty much. But that has changed. That has changed. Tim saw some absolutely there in Glasgow. But if you talk to business people like I do right now, the boards and the chief executives, they are all looking to the future. How do we decarbonize quickly? Which way do we go? If we are in the world of carbon and energy, how quickly can we change? What can we do? It's a completely different way of looking at it. If you like, it's almost like if you, as a business, or a state and territory are invested in the future, thinking 10, 20, 30 years ahead, you just get on with it. If you're a federal government thinking only about the next 3 months, 5 months, you just don't get on with it. It's all about just trying to win the election. But basically, states, territories, and businesses are moving fast. I think we would easily be able to get to 50, 60% by 2030. Science says we need to get to 75% by 2030. But boy, oh boy, if we actually had that motivation, that motivational target in front of us, businesses, states, territories will move very, 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 very fast.
Thanks, Greg. Nicki, following on from that, there's a number of questions around the economy. There was, as you know, some modelling put out by the federal government showing what they took into consideration around getting to net zero by 2050 when they made that announcement. I wondered if you could reflect on that modelling, but also talk us through the economic opportunity around action. I know you've talked about it already in this section, but it's sort of combining two questions from Mickey and Grace. One is about the modelling and what that shows us and whether it's credible, and the other one is where are the economic opportunities in the new economy, and how does Glasgow impact that?
Yeah, the economic modelling, the more you look at it, just the more you see is wrong with it. And I haven't found anybody who will talk about this and say it's credible. And I think it's strange and possibly tells you all you need to know that the government didn't get its own Treasury officials who have a very sophisticated economic model to do the modelling for them. They took an outside consultant and who was led by the Department of Industry. And they were told this is the scenario that you're going to model. So the baseline, so the what if we do nothing scenario was overly optimistic, and the many of the underpinning assumptions were just not credible. I mean, we don't even know how you model something when the technology that gets you your emissions down, when you don't know what the capital cost of that, what's the investment you need to get that technology. It's actually just not possible to get that modelling outcome. So I take it with a pinch of salt. But the more we look into it, one of the interesting things behind this is that the government talks about technology, not taxes. What people need to be really clear about is the technology is being paid for by taxes. So when the government says we're going to put $500 million into research into carbon capture and storage, that's your taxpayer dollars. And implicit in this modelling is a price on carbon. But it's a sneaky price on carbon, and it's an inefficient price on carbon. I know everybody gets very upset and it's politically inexpedient to talk about a price on carbon, but that is actually economically the best way out. You tax the things that you put a price on things you don't want to happen, so that's your stick, and you provide a carrot and incentives to make sure that we encourage the investment in the things that we do want. And we've also means we're raising money so that we can help the most vulnerable households and industries that will be affected by that change. This basically is all on I called it a last Hail Mary, basically, that the government is just going, we just hope that this, some miracle technology is going to come along and save us. And at the same time, we'll keep digging fossil fuels out of the ground and nothing will change. You just can't call those assumptions credible, and you can't have any faith in the modelling. They also talk about we'll all be $2,000 better off by 2050, and that's based on the national income, or the whole economy will be better off because we'll keep growing. Well, we would anyway. What they don't take into account is the costs of climate change, which amount to the trillions. We are hundreds of billions of dollars if we don't act, if we keep all pushing these fossil fuels out. It's completely nonsense modelling, quite frankly, and it makes me pretty cross. What they could have done, and what others have done, like Deloitte Access Economics put out a report towards the end of last year, looking at the economic opportunities. $680 billion worth of economic opportunities. Beyond Zero Emissions has just put something out the other day looking at just the export sector alone, $333 billion, which is 3 times the size of our fossil fuel exports. Barnaby Joyce saying the dollar will collapse. Well, in fact, he said it would be devalued. Well, if you're representing farmers and possibly miners, a lower currency is actually a good thing for you. It makes us more competitive. I mean, it's just voodoo economics, to quote, I think, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. None of it makes any sense. But there's some good, credible modelling out there, lots of good, credible modelling from all sorts of organisations, including Deloitte Access, from Beyond Zero Emissions using Alpha Beta, our own modelling from the Climate Council. There's a lot of modelling out there that just shows you there are billions of dollars worth of economic opportunity, tens of thousands of new jobs that we can create if we move in the right direction. And I'll give you one quick example before I stop talking on this one. The New South Wales government has announced around $3 billion in incentives for specifically for the hydrogen sector. They believe that they will get co-investment from the private sector of around 80 to more than $200 billion co-investment. So that's a pretty good return on investment for our taxpayer dollars. A lot better than throwing money out the window to technologies that have not worked for the last 20 years, that are technically unfeasible and financially unfeasible.
Thanks, Nicki. That's really useful. There's quite a few questions coming through around solutions and opportunities. And Tim, I recall when we were working together at the Climate Commission, one of the early pieces that you put out and did a speech on was Australia as the energy superpower. That was about 2012. And that sort of phrase has gained a lot of traction since then. I wondered if you could reflect on, you mentioned that there was a number of inspiring things at Glasgow, whether it has given you more sort of passion about this idea of Australia as an energy superpower, what it could look like, but what are the risks in terms of failing to act at a federal level fast enough?
Sure. Well, look, one of the big, subject areas, I suppose, particularly in the technology displays globally, was is hydrogen. Everyone was talking about hydrogen, and there are major projects under development in the US, in Asia, and in Australia. So it's a sort of a race, really, to see who can develop the most cost-effective green hydrogen and who can do it fast and who can develop the expertise. Now, Andrew Forrest was at the COP. He was there almost every day and around the Australian Pavilion constantly. I interviewed him about what he was doing, and he just, I think 2 days before I interviewed him, signed a $12 billion deal to sell green hydrogen into Europe to a European company within the next, I think, 5 years. So anyone who thinks hydrogen is not going to be there in volume very, very soon, I think is likely to be wrong, because I don't think people like Andrew Forrest waste their money and sign contracts like that if they can't deliver. So green hydrogen lets you process minerals onshore. So the reason Andrew Forrest is interested, among many, is that he exports a lot of iron ore, and if he could export iron or steel rather than iron ore, he'd be making more money, and Australia would be wealthier. So I think that's it's really, that is an area which is happening. The change is just very, very rapid, and there is a genuine race on. Now, we're not going to win that race without government support. We're going to need a huge amount of government support to transition as quickly as we can, not to brown hydrogen or blue hydrogen, but to green hydrogen, because that's where the money will be at scale. So that was just one of these areas in terms of Australia as an energy superpower that was important. The other one that is really huge is cable building. I was just reading about, when I was at the COP, about the first submarine cables that were for telecommunications in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. It took a long time to get them right and operating, but they changed the world. So the next set of cables that are going to be doing that are electricity generation cables. And can you imagine what it means to run cables east-west across the globe cheaply? So the sun will literally never set, because on those things, you'll always be able to bring in solar energy from somewhere into the night if you've got east-west running cables interconnecting the world. So, and it is, it's potentially cheaper to export electrons than it is molecules, molecules like hydrogen. So I think there's going to be a huge push into that area as well. And, Australia we have got almost limitless wind and solar potential generation in this country. I mean, there's more than there's more potential than we will ever use. So I think that in terms of that energy superpower, we're also very close to the tipping point where we're going to see a more integrated approach to energy. It won't be oil and gas being traded. It'll be electrons and hydrogen in the future.
Thanks, Tim. Greg, I've got a question here from Alan, which sort of extends on what Tim has been talking about, but more specifically in terms of our exports, and noting that that's sort of been a pivot by the federal government in the last little bit to move from saying, if you have renewables, you can't keep the lights on. That's been disproven, to now saying, if we don't have coal, we don't have any tax dollars, forgetting about the fact we all pay a fair bit of income tax, etc. I wondered if you can talk to us about what is the alternative for export industries other than coal, and Alan's specifically talking about how we replace coal and gas exports with high value metal, value-added metal exports and other things.
Sure, and I always think you should start from the global point of view, and looking at the IEA reports how to get to net zero. They show a very interesting graph of the value of coal production and export sort of monotonically declining to very, very little by 2050. But at the same time, the value of exports of new economy metals and minerals just growing to roughly the same amount, possibly even more. So we have a choice. The choice is, do we go up that other curve? New economy metals and minerals. We have lots of them. We actually have lots of them. It's a question of whether we develop those or not. The thing that worries me is there are other countries also that have lots of them that can actually export and build their own export industry. So it becomes critical for us, I believe, and governments, state governments and territories to actually say, right, which of the minerals, obviously nickel, copper, lithium, molybdenum, many of the other metals that we actually need when we electrify everything. We can do that. But the thing we have, and I think others have pointed it out, is we have a nation the size of a continent. A lot of sunshine, people might have noticed, a lot of wind, a lot of waves. So we can create the electrons that we need to do the processing that we need, as Twiggy Forrest wants to do it. We actually can do it. We just have to have the gumption to get on with it. So I have no doubt we can make that transition. I have no doubt whatsoever. The interesting thing about it as well, if you're in mining in the coal industry, you actually know 90% of what mining in the hard rock industry is about. Most of these things are transferable skills. If you're an electrician in the coal industry, you can be an electrician in the nickel industry. A lot of these skills are absolutely transferable. That has to be worked out, has to be pointed out, and finding that fair transition becomes important. But we have a big, big export industry to win.
Thanks, Greg. And Nicki, I wondered if you could reflect on this further as well. The sheer scale of the opportunities for Australia, and does that sort of equation change at all with Glasgow? Like when companies are looking at what's happened in Glasgow, will there be a new calculus for Australian companies about where, or investors about where they think they should be investing, or what opportunities there are in the carbon transition, even when the federal government has been failing to act? What do you see in sort of the see business doing in response to this?
Yeah, well, we're seeing a lot of businesses already move. I think the climate tracker says to just around 20% of top 2,000 businesses around the world, and a similar percentage of listed companies in Australia have net zero targets embedded already. Super funds are moving more in this direction. Investor groups are being very active. Consumers are being very active in the voice around what they want and choosing more sustainable products. So there's a lot of voice coming from down up rather than the top down from the government. But to get the best outcomes, you basically need to have both things happening simultaneously. Businesses will no doubt respond to that consumer demand to a point, but companies like Unilever have said, we try and balance the needs of our consumers and being sustainable, but we also need to make a profit. And the question is, can they switch to being 100% net zero or getting to net zero and still be as profitable as they are in the current circumstances? And a lot of businesses need a lot of help with people like Greg, who are actually providing that sort of support. This is how you do the transition. But there's no doubt that they are moving in that direction. And the thing that I found astounding this year is not just those international sort of conferences and voices that I mentioned earlier, but you look at the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Industry Group, all of these quite conservative business organisations, some of which even 2 years ago were saying we know net zero will be terrible, have all flipped around 180 degrees and all saying this is where we need to go. And that's a very, very powerful voice. So we've got consumer groups, we've got businesses tending to move in the right direction. It does take time though, and it does take investment, and we need to have a lot more investment, I think, than we currently have. It's a little bit behind the 8 ball. Getting governments to co-sponsor investment with the private sector is really important. So those initiatives like the New South Wales government will help us. But I think the writing is on the wall. We're seeing more and more boards elect people or appoint people who have an ESG focus to make sure that it's helping them. The Investor Group on Climate Change has just come out in the last 24 hours and said boards need a lot more help to get where they're going. But at least a lot of them, many are heading in the right direction, and they see that opportunity. And I think if you look at what the ACT government's done with their fleet transition towards electric vehicles, for example, this is spurting up new industries. It's not just cars, obviously. We're thinking about buses. The New South Wales government, it's very expensive to get new electric buses. They've said, right, well, we'll start manufacturing our own. So it's not just about green steel or hydrogen. There are new things that we can be manufacturing here, saying, well, actually, we might now have competitive advantage in some of these new industries and get them sparking off. So there are lots of smaller ideas as well. It's not just about the big picture, although of course energy, transport, building efficiency, these are the things that are the big picture items that make a big difference. But we can all make lots of difference. I mean, Tim knows all about asparagopsis and how to make cows produce less methane, so that those who choose to eat meat, might be able to do so in the future without having those associated methane emissions. Not as much as associated with LNG, I don't think, but there's so many brilliant people around there doing brilliant things, and there's demand. And as long as we as consumers make that thought known, make our purchases, make our investment decisions, and make our vote count and be vocal on all those fronts, then we can be part of that change and push that change to happen even faster. But clearly, other parts of the world are already moving down this path, and some more rapidly than others. But we don't want to be the laggard. As Greg says, we need to be out there and have that first mover advantage.
Thanks, Nicki. I love those fighting words there. We're joined by another guest, Matilda, who is going to sit here for the last little bit, I think.
Hello, Matilda. How are you, sweetie? She's gorgeous.
Tim, I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of questions coming through. We touched on the election earlier, but there's a lot coming through on how important is the next federal election, and what does it take to get a much more climate-friendly administration. There's obviously a lot of independent candidates with climate platforms campaigning this election. The ALP is likely to announce their climate targets in the coming month, as reported today or yesterday by Philip Curry. Wonder if you can reflect on the importance of the election and what people need to do to be engaged in that process over the next few months.
Sure. Look, I think the best way of thinking about that, Amanda, is through the lens of this COP27, the meeting in Egypt. So let's imagine Australia goes to the meeting in Egypt and we offer nothing new. It's just more frustration. It's more lead in the saddle in terms of trying to move forward. We will end up with a worse world, and potentially one where we tip over into dangerous climate change if we just hold back, if we can hold back things long enough. But imagine a world where then we go to COP27 with a real new and very meaningful target, an ambitious target. Imagine the energy that would give to the whole process, given that we are really the ones holding a lot of action back. I just think there is no election that Australians have held in my lifetime anyway that have been more meaningful in terms of the fate of the planet than this one. This election really is the one where Australia potentially can either make a massive difference to these global negotiations by coming forward with something very positive and a stretch target, or won't do it at all. Now, how do we deliver that? Well, I'm not sure whether either of the major parties are going to deliver what's required, but I could imagine an Australian Parliament where we had a party in power with a number of independents that they were dependent upon, who had very strong views on climate change. Then you might start getting some stretch targets that you need, But look, whatever way people are thinking of voting in the next election, I just say that, climate has to be one of the major considerations, simply because we are at such a critical time, and this is really an opportunity we can't afford to miss. I mean, imagine if we do miss this next year target. What is the future going to be like for us? What's our economy going to be like? What opportunities will we miss in terms of the slice of this new clean economy? What will the costs be in terms of communities that are going to be let down through lack of planning in the coal areas and so forth? The money wasted, the things the coal mines built that'll probably never be operated. I mean, the costs will just go on and on. It's a really critical year for us, this one. So I think, the message is think about what you can do at this next election to make a difference, because there's so much hangs on it.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really good summary of how important this election will be. And I'm conscious of time because we're unfortunately running out, and there's so much more I could be asking all of our panelists. I wanted to emphasise, following on from what Tim has said, that the Climate Council will be very much in the new year campaigning strongly on climate, as we always do. But in the election context, there is a lot for us to do. And our team will post a whole bunch of resources through the chat, but also in a follow-up email, so that you can see the whole range of opportunities that you can be involved in what we are doing, from taking action on our campaigns, contacting your MPs, writing letters to the editor, making sure that climate change is constantly in the media cycle, sharing our reports and explainers, and donating to make sure that we can continue doing what we do best. And during the election, we'll do a lot of myth busting. There's always a lot of BS that comes out during election campaigns, and on climate, it will be no different. So we will be doing that, as well as helping to define the way that climate change is talked about prior to the election, and then critically after it, to make sure that we can put as much pressure on for whoever wins to get good climate outcomes. So I want to thank all our panelists. I'm sure you'd agree with me, they have such a depth and breadth of information to share with us, and I could be asking them questions all evening. And I just wanted to thank the audience today. I've really enjoyed seeing all the discussion that's been coming through, lots of different questions. Hopefully we got to a bunch of them, but feel free to send further questions through as well. And as you know, the Climate Council is a community funded organisation, and these webinars aren't possible without your support. So if you would like to contribute to the Climate Council and our efforts, there's links in the chat to do that. There's a recording of this particular webinar that will be emailed to you, so you can send it to your friends. And if you didn't get to see all of it, you'll be able to catch up with it as well. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll be sending you a bunch of resources as well. So I hope you've really enjoyed tonight, and have a really good evening. Stay engaged. I think if the Glasgow COP, having seen it from all the way across the other side of the world, it's actually made me feel really energized. I've just come back from maternity leave in the last few weeks, and you know, sitting working from home with my little 6-month-old boy, making his noises out in the kitchen and other places, and reading all of this climate news coming through, it just really reinforced to me how important the next little bit of time will be in safeguarding his future, and yours too, honey. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and look forward to keeping in touch with you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Good night, Matilda.
Bye. Yeah. See you.